I've seen like
Yeah.
multi-corps where you have business teams discussing with developers on WhatsApp and literally committing to commissions or payment terms on WhatsApp. And then you don't see this in the body of the contract. I always feel like legal's brought into the room when there's a fire, and instead of bring us into the room before you even think about cooking.
Hello, friends, and welcome to this week's video. It's a special one because I have my very good friend Sme in the house today. And we've been talking about finance/legal and how the two often overlap for a very long time in different settings. And I think we've been wanting to do this for a while as well, eh?
We have.
So super excited that we can finally sit and just tackle some of the issues that we've come across in our professions. So for those joining and listening and watching for the first time, my name is Tanaka. I'm a finance professional. I've been working in the region for about 9 years with different companies across different industries. And I will give Sme the chance to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sme. I am a legal professional, commercial lawyer specifically, with about 8 years of experience in the region, predominantly as an in-house lawyer, which means I've worked quite closely with the business side and seen how companies negotiate contracts from small to big businesses, from small to big contracts themselves. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
You've done very well for yourself, Sme.
Thank you. So have you.
Thank you. And you mentioned contracts, which is where I'd actually love us to start off. But possibly before we even get to contracts in a little more detail, let's talk about the commercial law. I understand the UAE commercial law has changed, or should I say there have been some updates to the commercial law. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So it's definitely more than just a basic update because they've basically rehauled the entire civil transactions law, and it should come into effect soon, I believe, on the 1st of June. But I'll say mostly what's important about the changes is it's going to impact a lot of how companies have been approaching negotiations, and hopefully force them to tighten up their contracts and protect themselves more, because now it won't just be looking at the contract itself, but it will be looking beyond that.
Okay. Beyond the contract, What are we talking about?
So we're talking about what leads up to the actual contract, right? Which is your standard negotiations. And depending on the size of a business, this can sometimes happen informally. And actually, scratch that. I'm going to say all businesses. It happens informally. I've seen like multi-corps where you have business teams discussing with developers on WhatsApp and literally committing to commissions or payment terms on WhatsApp. And then you don't see this in the body of the contract, you know. And then unfortunately, depending on the region, this can actually lead to a dispute later on where that third party then comes with a claim against the company and bringing forward evidence that was actually in a WhatsApp chat, right? So because of that, now the courts will be looking at how the negotiations went. What were the terms that they agreed to? What was the intention of the parties? And whether this was all done in good faith, right? Good faith will be a very big player here, that you cannot just also terminate negotiations that have been ongoing in bad faith, right? So when you're looking at SMEs especially, you're now looking at putting in place best practices to make sure that you're protected in your contract, right? And making sure that you've reflected all the things that you discussed beforehand in the contract to give you better protections.
Okay. You spoke about WhatsApp.
Yes.
And I too have been privy to a lot of very important conversations and agreements being exchanged or, you know, signed off on WhatsApp through text or audio. Would the court of law actually consider WhatsApp messages or audios as supporting documentation or evidence. Excuse my language, I'm not quite technically legally sound, but if you understand what I mean, would the court of law really take that and consider that as part of, the documentation presented to support a stance?
So that will always depend on what the law says in that specific country, right? And the reason I say this is because the UAE is a hub, right? We're a hub. We're dealing with companies that are doing business in the UAE, but doing business with other countries as well. So I would say the focal point shouldn't be more on, will a party be able to use this against me? But more, what can I do to make sure it's very clear what our intention was, right? So even if you've negotiated on WhatsApp, that's not a bad thing. But best practice would then be to formalize this, right?
Right.
Which is not necessarily get into the contract, but more drop an email, right? Because WhatsApp is on your phone. We now have Outlook on your phone. You've got mail on your phone.
Yeah.
In the same way, you can just do this back and forth. You can easily then be like, okay, great, I'll send you an email just to confirm all these details. And then go to your email and put in everything that you can remember from the WhatsApp and, just drop that email and ask that other party to say, okay, can you confirm if this is my understanding? So that then just formalizes it and it gives both parties a very clear reference point, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go into the nitty-gritties of how someone can then dispute it and say, I didn't send this WhatsApp, or this is a company WhatsApp, or I'm not the one who is talking about this. It's just send it on email. Everybody's got a company email. It'll be very clear who you were talking to and what the intention was at the time. Yeah.
Right. So for the longest time, I have believed that the word that stands true is what's written in your contract. But what you're basically communicating now, as I understand it, is as long as you have email support or documentation of agreements outside of what is actually written and signed off from the contract, then that too will be considered in negotiation.
Yep. So the contract will always be primary.
Okay.
100%, right? Because the whole principle of having the freedom to contract is to allow parties to come together and decide what they want and then put in a contract that will then prevent disputes in the future, right? But sometimes we miss detail. Okay? I don't know how many times I reviewed a contract and I'm like, there's no termination clause. Like, there's no exit out of this contract. And which is like it sounds like the most basic thing, but you'd be surprised how many companies will even contract, for example, with a purchase order, right? A simple purchase order. And that is the actual contract itself. And you'll notice that it will state when it begins sometimes. And then there's no clear way of getting out of it. Like maybe it will say this purchase order will be valid for the next 2 years.
Right.
What if something happens in between and someone needs to exit? At times, there's no termination clauses. There's no exit strategy. And with some contracts, this can be like a really big issue, right? So having said all of this, you might find that maybe discussions were had beforehand that, oh, yes, but, we're going to always terminate if XYZ happens. But this conversation then happened informally.
Right.
And it wasn't put in the contract. And then you will find that certain clauses that you then don't put in the contract, by default, the law then applies to govern those things.
Right.
And you don't want that to happen. You want to be the ones in control of your contract.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, that's very clear. And I mean, what's the one or two possibly things that you think strong businesses, even today, are still doing the old way, which could seriously hurt them during, for example, a payment dispute? Like, what are the old habits that businesses are really struggling to move away from in light of the changes and the updates that are happening here in the UAE from a legal standpoint, but possibly also from a financial standpoint, to your knowledge?
I'd say the issue is always the assumption that you're not going to break up. 'Cause
Breakups are hard.
breakups are hard. They are, and everybody forgets that when you go into a relationship, whether it's romantic or business or otherwise, the intention is never to get out of it,
Yeah.
right? And so there's always this slight friction, I feel, especially being in-house between legal and commercial, where legal is trying to say, let's just consider what might happen. We're not saying
Yeah.
that your potential client is going to ditch us or, do something wrong, but we're saying in case something happens, maybe even we do something,
Right.
and they want to terminate.
Because it can go either way,
It can
right?
go either way,
Yeah.
right? And or even let's look at the current situation, that the geopolitical situation that was impacting the region, right? Maybe some people could have predicted that, but not everybody could have predicted that,
Yeah.
right? And then you have basic clauses like force majeure that some companies would have included in their contracts, and then some would have actually assumed that this applies by default, right? And then in the UAE, under the UAE law, it does, but because a lot of companies in the region use English law, interestingly enough, English law does not apply force majeure by default. You actually have to put it into the contract. Right?
Okay.
Otherwise, it will not apply. So it's like basic things like that, that let's not assume everything will go well. I'd say that is the underlying principle, because once you have that in place, then you will calculate all your risks and try and make sure all your clauses accommodate them, whether it's a termination clause, liability clause, or payment mechanisms or dispute resolution. Then you just make sure that those are tight.
So over and above potentially not having some important clauses included in the contracts, I think a lot of business owners generally think the contract is signed, so I'm covered, right? But are there any other terms or clauses that would still be very difficult to enforce, even if they are included in the contract? I mean, how easy is it to enforce all the clauses and all the terms that you do document? Or how hard is it?
It depends. But I would say generally, if you're looking at, let's look at payment, because that's always the biggest issue, right?
Yeah.
That it might not necessarily be hard to enforce it, but it takes time. It becomes expensive. So a business now has to calculate whether the cost of actually going through the process is worth the outstanding amount, right? And because of issues like that, then you're like, okay, maybe we could have avoided this by having clear payment mechanisms, right? By having stronger protections in the contract itself.
Yeah.
Because usually these claims, of course, sometimes payment issues might happen just because a company has gone broke. But usually it happens because one party thinks something is true and the other party doesn't, and the contract doesn't address that specific issue, right? Then now you're disputing. So I'd say payment clauses and then dispute resolution clauses, which then just govern the contract and not just payments. Those two are key, because you want to know how to deal with a problem when it happens. And it must be very clear. What are we going to do? Do we first start with a conversation between the two companies, within a certain period? Then we're saying, if we cannot agree with this, about this issue in, let's say, 30 days, then either party can raise a claim in the courts, right?
Right.
That I would say, like, gives you a clear process versus, me waking up tomorrow like, okay, they haven't paid us. Okay, we're going to file in court, because then it's an expense on our end, but also it will probably damage the relationship between the parties as well.
Right. I love that you mentioned payments, because I think principally in any business transaction, the idea is exchange of goods or service for payment, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes businesses then find out they're in a position, they're kind of exposed, right? When most cases the payment isn't coming or has not come according to expected timeline, right? And so my follow-up question to that is, when do you think or when do you recommend would be a good time to then go for arbitration, for example, assuming all the terms are clearly documented, the payment terms, that is. When do you think is a good time to then follow the process to recover, the payments that the company should receive? And I'll give you context, right? Because from my standpoint, as the finance manager, fractional CFO, whatever position I would take in the business, I'm constantly looking at the cash flow in and out, right? I'm also looking at aged receivables. And for me, the question to the commercial manager or the business owner would be, how do we make sure that we get the money into the business, especially if the work has already been completed? So I find that oftentimes this is where the kind of friction maybe or the disconnect between finance and legal then comes in. So with that in mind, how would you approach a scenario like that?
I would take us back. And I know this is like a roundabout way of answering your question.
Okay.
But I always feel like legal's brought into the room when there's a fire. And instead of bring us into the room before you even think about cooking.
Right.
So, and because then if we're going to look at it from that angle, then I'll be like, if we go back to the beginning, then we're going to look at due diligence. Right? Who are you going to business? Do you actually understand who you're going to business with? Right?
Yeah.
Do you have a relationship with these people? Because how we will approach, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like someone borrowing your favorite bag, right?
Like handbag?
Yeah, like handbag.
Okay.
Like who you're going to give that bag to depends on your relationship with that person,
Right.
right? And your or not even okay. Let's forget about handbag. Let's just talk about borrowing money to someone, right? There's some people that you'll lend money to and you expect it to come back, and then there's people that you'll lend money to and you're like, okay,
I'm just giving this away.
yeah.
And I'm fine with it.
And what do you base that on?
Your experience.
Your experience with them, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, I'd say it's the same. How we're going to approach a dispute is now dependent on the relationship between the parties. Is this a new client? Do we have an ongoing relationship? Do we have history with them, right? So you understand the risk appetite. You understand the, just the history will tell you most of the times that how do you expect it to play out? So if we're dealing with new players, right, new counterparties, which is now
because in that case you wouldn't have history, right? If you're dealing with a new person,
no.
Yeah.
And yes, it is a gamble, but in like we would then be looking at do the best that you can beforehand to make sure you've protected yourself, right? Under due diligence, right? Know who you're going into business with. What's the value of the transaction? Is it a big transaction? Do you have securities in place? Right. What have you done to make sure that you will get back your money as much as possible? Then I'll say if you've ticked all those boxes, then we skip back to, okay, now you have a dispute, right? Like we mentioned before, that those are the clauses that needed to have been there, the clear dispute process. Because that will map out, that will mean you don't even have to be thinking at this point about what are we doing. We're following that process because that's what we're contractually bound to. We're coming to the table, the two management people or whoever's been designated in the contract to discuss the issue, to try and, like, it's kind of like it's a negotiation, like a mediation sort of between the parties.
So you have the clarity even before the event then takes place. Yeah. Yes, and that facilitates for a smoother process.
Yeah. Because then even at that point, you'd have your question was, when do we go to arbitration? That's already in the contract, because the contract now then says if the parties fail to agree within this period, then this happens next, right? And then if we're going to arbitration at that point, it then will tell you whether that arbitration award will be binding or not. It will even tell you where you're having the arbitration. It will tell you what language you're having the arbitration with. It will
Right.
tell you how many arbitrators each party can choose, right? So that should be decided before the contract is signed, because it should be in the contract. Then at that point, you guys are going to legal and saying, okay, so these guys haven't paid us in 2 months. Can you send a formal legal notice, right? And then we start the process, but we're just following through something that's already in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have, contractually, we can include the clause to have the UAE law as the governing law, right? We also have the option here in the UAE to use the DIFC.
Yes.
Can you talk about the difference between the two?
So
And
essentially,
potentially which cases either one would be most suited or most beneficial for the business?
so I'd say essentially the difference between the two is that the UAE law is UAE law, right? And it tends to be, it's civil, it's a mix of civil and Islamic principles, right? Which, without going into a complicated speech, is essentially one way of, one framework of the law, right? And then DIFC law is English law based, which is common law principles, right? So I would say the world is, maybe I'm biased here because I come from a common law jurisdiction,
Right.
but I'd say business wise, the world kind of leans more towards common law. So you find that a lot of businesses in the region tend to use English law as their
Okay.
governing law, right? But having said that, you find that a lot, especially if we're dealing with government entities or semi-governmental entities,
Yeah.
or onshore registered, mainland registered entities, that they tend to be UAE law, right? So this is always going to be a negotiation point between
Yeah.
companies, right? Depending on which company you're dealing with. Some will go UAE law, some will go English law, right?
Okay.
And then usually if you go English law and DIFC courts, then if you have a dispute, it'll be managed by the DIFC courts.
Okay.
But if you're going to do UAE law, and UAE courts, if you have a dispute, it'll be managed by the UAE courts. Usually we don't do a mix of, let's say, UAE law than DIFC courts, because it just complicates things. It's easier to go with one system, right? I can't say which is better.
Right.
I would say that it depends on what the company's intentions are at the end of the day and what the parties agreed to. But we do feel sometimes that there's more clarity with English law, only because it's more seasoned, right? UAE
Okay.
law it's very young.
So they're still developing
They're
it?
still developing. It made a lot of amazing growth and changes to it. But English law has been there for a very long time. So the principles are pretty clear.
Right.
Yeah.
The last question I would have for you on contracts and, related topics is, in your experience, can you give me one or two clauses that are often overlooked by businesses or business owners when it comes to, drafting their contracts and covering themselves adequately?
So I'll say, depending on the nature of your business and if this does apply, I'll say schedules. And by schedules, I don't mean attachments. I mean actual schedules for the scope of work, right? Because that can then trigger delays. And then you're looking at maybe delayed damages or
Right.
penalty for late payment or maybe penalty by another name. So I would say that is always quite important when you're looking at the scope of work, going into detail as much as possible when you're talking about the KPIs. There's a word that is running away from me right now. But essentially, if, whether it's a service, especially where it's a service, right? And you're saying performance is determined by meetings, like hitting certain things, be very clear what that is.
Right.
If it's something that a products are being sold, when do you want it to be delivered, right? What happens if it's not delivered by that date?
Right.
Who incurs the cost? Is it of maybe it's even a manufacturing delay? Because it's not always about something just not getting delivered, because it's you don't always have the option to, okay, we'll terminate this contract and buy from someone else. It might be a very niche or specific thing. In that case, the client will wait or will have no choice but to wait. But then what happens in that case? Are you going to compensate them for that? Or
Yeah.
if the cost of making that thing has gone up, are they going to compensate you for that? Like,
Right.
so I'd say maybe like milestones. That's the word I was looking for.
Right.
Yeah, like you have very clear criterias for your milestones, for your payments. Just try and be as critical and pessimistic or cynical as possible, to look at it from what's the worst thing that could possibly happen,
Right.
and how do we protect ourselves, or how do we not protect ourselves, but how do we consider this in the contract. And I think this is what a lot of businesses struggle with, which is why I'm going to say, call a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Call a
Because
consulting
you're not going to see
service,
all
call
the
Pillar.
corners.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
you're not going to see and this is why you have seasoned professionals who've dealt with different businesses. And I'm not saying that we know everything, but chances are most of the time we'll be like, you know what, actually I dealt with something similar about 5 years ago. Let me just have a think and see how we can, do this.
Exactly.
When you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think the biggest, I think I'm probably going to segue here, is the biggest fear most of the time from people, from companies, SMEs, is the cost, right?
Yes.
Oh, we can't afford them. Oh,
We're not at that stage yet. Yeah.
But you don't want to skip that and then have to then be going through arbitration.
Yeah.
And by the way, I meant to mention this earlier, that people always talk about arbitration like it's the cheapest. Arbitration is expensive.
Right.
Right.
Time-wise and financially.
And financially.
Yeah.
Especially financially, right? So don't just easily think, oh yeah, but if this happens, we're just going to go to court. I'm like, especially, you're a small business. Can you afford this? Do you understand the costs that come? Let's forget the legal fees, as in the lawyer. Also, let's keep in mind that the UAE is a space where most proceedings, especially in UAE courts, they are happening in Arabic. Unless you're an Arabic company, you're going to need someone to translate your documents. Those are costs. You're going to need someone to draft your documents in Arabic. Those are costs. You're going to need someone who understands this from a legal point of view, meaning you need an Arabic lawyer, a local lawyer. And at the same time, chances are you're English speaking. And if that's the case, you need then another lawyer or a bilingual lawyer who's at least pretty much good in both languages, that they can translate to you what the risk is, but communicate that on paper, and there's no gap between, right? So dispute resolution can be quite expensive. So don't get into the dispute, which is why get your advice beforehand.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that you say that. And I think for me, what I'm getting from our conversation so far is the contract is not just a document.
No.
It's not just writing what you expect and what's expected of you on paper. It's pretty much the foundation of your working relationship with the client, or if you are the client, with your counterparty. And because of that, it truly must be taken with all levels of seriousness, right?
100%.
And that being said, it's always advisable to get someone who's knowledgeable on the subject to, if you've drafted something already, have a look at what you've drafted. Otherwise, to get the help to put all of your clauses together and have them tailored to the nature of the relationship that you want to establish with this person you're getting into business with, right?
I agree. And I'll say, in addition to that, it's not just, don't just limit the legal title to contracts. Like, because when everybody thinks legal, they just think contracts. But I would say that you forget that from beginning to end of your business cycle, there's legal aspects of it. Before you even set up your company, there's legal aspects that need to be considered. As you set up your company, there are legal aspects, and usually people don't do it independently, right? You're going into a partnership with someone. What happens if you break up, right? Or what happens
Speaking of that, a lot of people have come to me, complaining in essence, because a lot of business setup companies, unfortunately, do not disclose the full reality of the arrangement for business setup, right? Because, the licenses need to be renewed ever so often, and then you have the visas, and a lot of that requires the PRO.
Wait, there's another partner.
Exactly. Yep. There's another partner, there's an additional cost, all of that, So I'm just, kind of emphasizing what you're saying, that even from setup itself, all the way.
It's like there's financial, there's legal, like in-house. I'll tell you what, in my experience in-house, the one department I worked the most with was finance. If you were in a room, there was very few chances, especially if you're looking outside commercial negotiations, right? Finance will be in that room because there will always be an angle where you need them, whether it's for tax purposes, whether it's for structuring purposes, and legal has to be there to also look at the legal aspects of that.
See, let me tell you, you've been in good rooms, okay? Because from my end of the spectrum, oftentimes I've actually felt, and I've spoken about this with my other finance counterparts, that we're left out of the conversation.
Oh, that happens. We're left out as well.
Until it's the last minute and everyone's trying to scramble for solutions and try and put the fire out, So yeah, like you're saying, having finance and legal part of the initial conversation.
Yes.
Really goes a long way in establishing a solid foundation for.
Because sometimes you'll come to these problems and you're like, we didn't need to be here.
Exactly.
Why did you even set up this company in this jurisdiction?
Exactly.
Why did you even this? And then you'll find that sometimes you have a single business owner who's got different aspects of their business, and they're just like setting up here, here, and you're like, do you understand the ramifications of some of these costs? Like every time you set up a company, you're looking at corporate governance, you're looking at filings, and you're looking at accounting. And these will all be separate costs. And then forget the costs. These are all separate documentations that you're managing, all these things. So I would say...
Often handled by one team
yes.
in some instances. And obviously in that case, it's having to consider the regulations for each different,
You'll find one in mainland, one is in a free zone, one is in Sharjah, one is in AGGM.
Exactly.
And then you're
they all have different rules.
There's different rules, absolutely different. And they will assume maybe because they set up the first one and maybe they could have gotten advice. And though that's actually a rare client who would have gotten advice on that, that will apply across the board. It doesn't. It doesn't apply across the board. There will be certain things that you need to do that you're not even aware of, and then you will incur fines that could have been, simply avoided. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day where she was asking about, I think she was trying to find a clause in the commercial transactions law that states that shareholders have to sign off on the financial statements of a company.
Right.
And we were just discussing that. I was just like, okay, yeah, it has to start with the directors, though, right? Right? It goes from the
Directors
directors to
sign.
the shareholders, and it usually happens at, the GM.
Yeah.
Like the
I
annual
mean,
general
shareholders
meeting.
generally
Exactly.
accept at the AGM.
And I'm like, see, the thing is, even if you don't have a lawyer, if you had someone in finance, they would know this, because those, again, are those overlapping things where you look at finding that either one or the other is aware of.
Right.
But you, as a shareholder or a business owner, small business owner, might not know about these things. And then you miss the deadlines.
Yeah.
And then, the Dubai tax authorities will come calling.
Yeah.
So, or, the regulatory authority.
Exactly.
But these are just penalties that could be avoided if you
100%.
have someone just understand your structure, understand what is it that you're trying to achieve here,
Yeah.
and give you some advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a client who registered for VAT unnecessarily so. Then they decided to deregister after a while and had to pay penalties for that. And you'd look at it and you think, how did we even get to registering in the first place, given the model that they're going for? Completely unnecessary,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think at that time it was a case of this is what everyone is saying, so I think this is what we need to do, but without intentional consultation with a knowledgeable person, a tax advisor, a finance advisor, etc. So, yeah, thank you, Smear. You've shared a lot of insight with us today.
Hopefully, it's worth something.
Definitely, definitely. Because like I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I do find out that a lot of legal aspects overlap with finance, right? Especially around contracts. And just what you've highlighted for us today, the importance of having contracts, but not just that, like contracts that encompass the reality of the agreement between the two parties is absolutely necessary. And with that, I myself have been inspired to champion for better contracts with my clients. And I'm hopeful, and I'm sure that all the listeners today have also benefited from all the gems you've shared.
I hope so. Inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you.